Hello and welcome. On this day, September 7th, 1709, the great poet, essayist, and literary critic Samuel Johnson was born. So I thought today I would just introduce you to The Vanity of Human Wishes, especially if you haven't read it before. You're really in for a treat. It's a bit of a long poem, so I won't read the whole thing, but I just want to highlight some of the beautiful passages here and just tell you a little bit about this poem. The whole title is called The Vanity of Human Wishes, the 10th satire of Juvenal imitated. Now, Johnson was writing in the 18th century, around the height of the neoclassical period. I think the height was in the early 18th century, so he's writing a little bit after that, but the neoclassical mode is still in full force. And the thing you have to understand about poets in England in the 18th century is that they were not the poets we often think about. When you think about poets today, you think of the moody, withdrawn, artistic types that are writing away in some attic or garret somewhere. But the 18th century poet was more of a public figure. He or she was a social critic. Their exercises in poetry wasn't so much about their internal feelings and how they processed these meditations. They were more examples of public rhetoric. So when a poet in the 18th century would withdraw privately to sit down and write, they were imagining themselves actually standing up publicly to speak. And so that's something to keep in mind with these satires and with a lot of neoclassical poetry. There are some exceptions, and Thomas Gray is one of them. And once you get into the later part of the 18th century, you have that romantic bend where poetry begins to be more withdrawn and dealing with feelings. But in the neoclassical age, feelings were held suspect, largely because of how passion and religious fervor in the 17th century led to the execution of the king. So there are politics involved in the subject matter and the mode of writing during this time. But Samuel Johnson, when he's writing this poem, he's writing a satire about humankind. And so a satire, we'll sometimes think satires are just poets making fun of each other, or being mean just for the sake of being mean, but satire here was really a moral venture. It was a way to uphold sanctity of morals, and also poets who were satirists were considered gatekeepers of religion and culture. Johnson's not criticizing any particular person. He really wants to, or this poem rather, wants to showcase the vanity of human wishes within the context of history. Johnson begins, "Let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru." So now we have this global scope. Observation is personified here. He's saying, let observation survey mankind. Remark each anxious toil, each eager strife, and watch the busy scenes of crowded life. You notice this personification has signaled a disinterested distance from the affairs of humankind, and it sets the tone for the poem to be critically disinterested in the plight of humanity. But towards the end, it will make a very pious application. But we start out very far away, distanced by this almost an indifference of death. Then say how hope and fear, desire and hate, o'erspread with snares the clouded maze of fate, where wavering man, betrayed by venturous pride to tread the dreary paths without a guide, as treacherous phantoms in the mist delude, shuns fancied ills or chases airy good. And now we're getting to the condition of humanity examined here by observation itself. And notice, this is a favorite with Johnson, these couplings of adjectives and nouns, they tend to be balanced oftentimes within the line. If you see here at line 10, shuns fancied ills or chases airy good. We have somewhat of an antithesis there with that adjective and noun on one side as being balanced with the other. Johnson, in his prose style and in his poetry, loves balance. How rarely reason guides the stubborn choice, rules the bold hand, or prompts the suppliant voice. How nations sink, by darling schemes oppressed, when vengeance listens to the fool's request. Fate wings with every wish the afflictive dart. Each gift of nature and each grace of art, notice the balance there of the prepositional phrase, of nature, of art, with fatal heat impetuous courage glows, with fatal sweetness elocution flows. Impeachment stops the speaker's powerful breath, and restless fire precipitates on death. That whole first paragraph, by the way, is a complete sentence. We have one complete period here, and Johnson will often, this is very characteristic of his style both in his essays and in his poetry, he will often allow the accumulation of clauses, phrases, dependent clauses, the balancing of opposites, the pairings of similar things to accumulate and lead up to this final conclusion at the end of the period. And at the end of the period, it usually concludes with a thud. And here we have it concluding on death. All of this, like the entire sentence, the anxious toil of mankind and the phantoms that delude them, and each gift of nature and of art, is leading on towards, just like the sentence, its conclusion, death. And restless fire precipitates on, which means hastens or falls down or races toward death. That monosyllabic word that just greets us at the completion of this period. These lines are lines of heroic couplets, which are rhyming pairs of lines of iambic pentameter. And what that means is, if you look closely at each line contains 5 stressed syllables. And these syllables are organized according to a pattern of iambic meter, which means unstressed syllable followed by stress. And that's repeated 5 times. So each line, let observation with extension view. There are 5 stressed syllables, and then with the couplet making it heroic. Survey mankind from China to Peru. So he begins with this very extensive distance, almost cosmological perspective on the globe and on the affairs of humankind. And he moves into the particulars. Johnson's essays make this pattern, this movement, all the time. He begins with a general statement, and then he begins to zero in on very, sometimes poignant, but very effective particular cases. And we get a catalog in this poem of particular cases. Now, the fact that the title is called The Vanity of Human Wishes is hearkening back to the Hebrew book in the Hebrew Bible, the Ecclesiastes of Solomon. King Solomon will say, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So he's kind of tapping into that tradition. But within the title itself, we have this look towards Juvenal. This is an imitation of Juvenal's 10th satire. Juvenal was a first century classical, he was a Latin poet, and he often composed satires against the emperor or criticizing the emperor, and also criticizing human life. The 10th satire is one like that, and it's been a favorite in the English tradition and on the continent. Europe and in England, preachers in the Middle Ages would go to Juvenal's 10th satire to find topics for sermons. So even though Juvenal, not a Christian poet, his 10th satire has been important in the English tradition for a long time. But what Johnson is doing, he's not just strictly imitating Juvenal, he's also adapting it to English history. If you look around line 100 of the poem, you can find a link to it in the description. He talks about Cardinal Wolsey, who was the cardinal under King Henry VIII. In English history is a perfect exemplar of the rise and fall of a statesman. He soared to epic heights and then eventually fell, lost everything. And Johnson writes here in the poem, in full-blown dignity, see Wolsey stand, law in his voice and fortune in his hand. To him the church, the realm, their powers consign. Through him the rays of regal bounty shine. Turned by his nod, the stream of honor flows. His smile alone security bestows. Still to new heights his restless wishes tower. Here we have the wishes from the title. The vain wishes to ascend with ambition. Still to new heights his restless wishes tower. Claim leads to claim, and power advances power, till conquest unresisted ceased to please, and rights submitted left him none to seize. And here comes the fall. At length his sovereign frowns. His sovereign, that's the King Henry VIII. At length his sovereign frowns. The train of state mark the king glance, and watch the sign to hate. Where'er he turns, he meets a stranger's eye. His suppliants scorn him, and his followers fly. At once is lost the pride of awful state, the golden canopy, the glittering plate, the regal palace, the luxurious board, the liveried army, and the menial lord. There's that catalog there, nicely accumulating. With age, with cares, with maladies oppressed, he seeks the refuge of monastic rest. Grief aids disease, remembered folly stings, and his last sighs reproach the faith of kings. Now in Juvenal's satire, the original satire, the subject in this portion of the poem was Sejanus, but Johnson changes it here to Wolsey to good effect. What is meant here by the reproach, at last his sighs, or his last sighs reproach the faith of kings? Shakespeare offers some hint, as does the history of Wolsey. In Shakespeare's King Henry VIII, which was possibly written with Fletcher as well, we have this scene where Cardinal Wolsey falls, and he's addressing Cromwell, and he says, "Mark but my fall, in that ruined me. Cromwell, I charge thee, fling away ambition. By that sin fell the angels. How can man then, the image of his Maker, hope to win by it? O Cromwell, Cromwell, had I but served my God with half the zeal I served my King, he would not in mine age have left me naked to my enemies." So this faith of kings is the service of kings, and the prioritization of the king over the service of God, which was Wolsey's downfall. Another interesting portion here, this is good for any grad students or anyone in higher education, this warning that Johnson gives. Having now warned against ambition with the case study of Wolsey, we now turn to the vanity of the ambition of learning and education. Here at line 136, or rather, here at line 135, when first the college rolls receive his name, the young enthusiast quits his ease for fame. Through all his veins the fever of renown burns from the strong contagion of the gown. Ambition here is like a fever, and this is important towards the end. It's kind of craziness. It burns. Contagion of the gown, that's the academic gown. If you were to go, if you enrolled at Oxford, you'd get an academic gown. So you'd attend classes in your gown, and it would look very, very sporty, and you'd look very much set apart in your erudition from the hoi polloi. But there's also this interesting allusion to the myth of Hercules that's going on here in this line. There's a story of Hercules, how he died. He put on a poisonous shirt. And so this gown, this academic gown that they wear at Oxford, has a contagion in it. And he says, "O'er Bodley's dome," that's the Bodleian Library, "o'er Bodley's dome his future labors spread, and Bacon's mansion trembles o'er his head." A bit of Oxford lore here. Roger Bacon was a 13th century philosopher and scientist who, there was a bridge in Oxford, and legend had it that when someone greater than Roger Bacon walked under it, the bridge would fall. And the bridge stood there for many years. It was demolished in the 18th century. The young academic walking under there and imagining Bacon's mansion trembling o'er his head. So there's this vanity that the poem is exposing in young academics or students. Pope says a little learning is a dangerous thing. It puffs one up with pride. I think that's what Johnson's getting at here. And there towards the end of that section, speaking about the student, "Deign on the passing world to turn thine eyes, and pause a while from letters to be wise. There mark what ills the scholar's life assail, toil, envy, want the patron and the jail. That's a dig at Lord Chesterfield, if you know that story. It's a great story, but perhaps for another video. The paradox being here that you must turn from your letters in order to be wise, not turn to books. You must turn away, and it's in that pausing, it's in that contemplation that wisdom comes, the poem is saying. Now, towards the end of the poem, it goes on with a catalog of the vanity of human ambition, of learning, of pride itself, of folly, of flattery, of social security, of courtly security, of fame. If human hopes are not to be resting in these, we're led to ask, well, what is the antidote? What should our hopes and fears be resting in? And there in the final paragraph of the poem, Johnson gives it to us. Where then shall hope and fear their objects find? Must dull suspense corrupt the stagnant mind? Notice those adjective and noun pairings, dull suspense, stagnant mind. Mind is very important here in this poem. It repeats 3 times at the end of the line in just this paragraph alone, and this is the first instance of it. Must helpless man in ignorance sedate roll darkling down the torrent of his fate? Should we just throw up our hands and wait for death? Must no dislike alarm, no wishes rise, no cries attempt the mercies of the skies? Inquirer, cease. Petitions yet remain, which heaven may hear, nor deem religion vain. And here we have that word, vain, the root word coming from the title, vanity. Though human wishes may be vain, human piety or religion may not be. Here we have this sudden turn to piety, religiosity. And some scholars have commented upon the absence of any explicitly Christian reference in this poem. And it's true. The piety here is not necessarily one of institutional piety. It fits in very comfortably within Christianity. And of course, Samuel Johnson was a pious Christian himself. And as an 18th century Englishman, he's obviously got that in mind. But it also is comfortable within some classical non-Christian forms of piety. And so he says, deems religion vain. Perhaps religion will not be deemed vain. Still raise for good the supplicating voice, but leave to heaven the measure and the choice. Ask, but then consign it into the hands of heaven. Notice heaven there is standing in for God as a synecdoche. But then we get the third person plural of God here, safe in his power, his eyes. Safe in his power, whose eyes discern afar the secret ambush of a specious prayer. Implore his aid, in his decisions rest. Secure whate'er he gives the best. Yet when the sense of sacred presence fires, and strong devotion to the skies aspires, pour forth thy fervors for a healthful mind, obedient passions, and a will resigned. There's that word, mind, again, which Johnson personally has a very strong interest in the stability of the human mind, because his whole life he battled depression and moments of mental instability, and so he was often finding ways to anchor himself, and piety, Christian devotion, was a way of doing that for him. The healthful mind, notice it's very different from the fever and contagion that the academic gowns gave, or the high hopes of aspiration that Wolsey had. A will resigned instead. For love, which scarce collective man can fill, for patience sovereign or transmuted ill, for faith that panting for a happier seat, counts death kind nature's signal of retreat. So under this mode, under this posture of living in the world, death becomes benevolent here. And we've seen this happen in his other poetry, especially his verses upon the death of Robert Levitt. Death is seen to be one who liberates. Death broke at once the vital train and freed his soul the nearest way. So death becomes a liberator there in that poem, as it is here. Kind nature's signal of retreat. These goods for man the laws of heaven ordain. These goods he grants. who grants the power to gain. And here's the concluding couplet. With these celestial wisdom calms the mind. So we have this tranquility here by celestial wisdom. With these celestial wisdom calms the mind and makes the happiness she does not find. So the happiness in the world is not actually in the world. The mind may seek it in the world and will not find it, but it must be made within the mind itself through celestial wisdom, and that's the message of the poem itself. So in a way, Johnson Christianizes Juvenal's poem, but it's not very strongly Christianized. It's a nice firm ending too, with this couplet, this epigrammatic couplet. Johnson's heroic couplets are not like Pope's heroic couplets. Pope, he's very lapidary, and each couplet is a unit, but Johnson's couplets often lead on, as his prose does, and it's interesting that this entire verse paragraph promoting celestial wisdom over worldly folly should end with that commendation, this sort of pious resignation. So that's a taste of Johnson's The Vanity of Human Wishes. Definitely go through and read the whole poem again to do the poem justice. Thanks for joining me, and until next time.